Folks, live from the studio, I'm Jimmy Selesky. Now, today, I'm going to do something we tend to do from time to time. Every couple weeks on this channel, I like to spin back around to a long-forgotten era and time in this country. If you dig far back in the annals of your memory, the furthest registers of your recollection, you may be able to recall COVID-19. Now, many of our media and political, best among us have conveniently decided that we're just going to move past this. It's over. We are no longer in a state of emergency. Why are we still talking about it? Who cares? Well, every now and then I care. I get a bad case of COVID, and not the sickness, just the want and need to bring it back up, because we are still, as we will get into in this episode, finding more and more about every single lie, or as Anthony Fauci likes to call them, untruths, as it pertained to the disease itself, its origins, how we should deal with it, the vaccines, and all the other things that during that 2 to 3 year period where we saw in this very condensed span of time, every single thing that was wrong with this country, from the people themselves, you, me, and all the other citizens, to the government, our politicians, our elites, the bureaucracies, the scientists, our systems. There was not one thing that made it out unscathed. And I think that's really why we need to move past it, right? The media doesn't want to talk about it anymore because they were exposed. The politicians don't want to talk about it anymore because they were exposed. A lot of the American people don't want to talk about it anymore because they were exposed. But I want to talk about it. Now, before we dive into the specifics of everything, I will preface this episode by saying I was inspired by a new kind of recent batch of leaked emails between Anthony Fauci, his senior advisors, Peter Daszak, the head of EcoHealth, and all these things that we'll discuss, primarily as it pertains to the quote-unquote lab leak theory. Now, the lab leak theory is a theory kind of in the same way that the Pythagorean theorem is a theory, in that we know it to be completely true, but for some reason we still call it a theory. For those of you unfamiliar, the lab leak theory is the preposterous supposition that the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus that first was exposed to human beings in Wuhan, China, may very well have been leaked from the Wuhan coronavirus lab in China. Now, I can understand why that seems so ridiculous. And I can understand why the much more likely theory that the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus had instead performed an incredibly rare feat, which is cross-species transmission. This is not something that you see often in viruses. It happens rarely. Why? Because viruses spend millions and millions of years, in many cases, evolving and adapting to a very specific genome, DNA of a certain species of animal or plant or whatever, so that they can effectively replicate themselves and reproduce and infect the host. So not very often do you see a situation where a virus spends millions and millions of years evolving to a specific DNA of a specific species. and then magically goes, oh, you know what? While we're at it, why don't we infect this species too? Imagine you take your Nintendo 64 cartridge, but you don't have a Nintendo 64. So instead, you just plug it into your MacBook Pro. Just jam it in there. And now you can play Legend of Zelda. Now you can play Mario Kart, right? Because that's how that works. It doesn't matter that the Nintendo 64 cartridge was designed for one very specific gaming console. No. Just plug it in and play, right? That's how viruses work. No. Not at all. So you do see this very rarely for that reason exactly. But this is apparently what happened with the coronavirus. Now, that in and of itself being a rare feat is compounded amazingly with the fact that not only did this virus perform cross-species transmission, but it just so happened to be in the same city where there was a lab synthesizing coronaviruses. What are the odds of that, as we've asked previously on this show? So you already have like the 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 something. I don't want to put an exact number on it because I don't know. I know it's extremely rare. You already have the incredibly unlikely odds that a virus is able to jump species at all. And then you compound that with the even arguably more unlikely odds that not only did it do that, but it did it in the exact same city across the street from the lab that was performing, experiments and things like that on this exact virus. And even beyond that, because now we're not done. But based off of emails that we are now coming to see, the exact specific function that we observed in SARS-CoV-2 that it allowed it to do what it did was a function that had been discussed by the people funding the research at this Wuhan laboratory. Is that not crazy? What are the odds of that? I mean, I still think this theory holds no water at all, because to me, it seems much more likely that all that coincidentally happened in a bowl of bat soup. But let's entertain this theory. First, let's take a look at Anthony Fauci's recent commencement speech at Columbia University, the Vagelos, I'm assuming that's Greek, School of Physicians and Surgeons, or College of whatever. Who cares? I can't stand academia. I really can't. Now, an alternate name for this episode could be A Tale of Two Speeches. Because while all of you last week were busy arguing on Facebook and Twitter and wherever else about Harrison Butker's commencement speech at Benedictine College, a Catholic university, where a devout Catholic man went on stage at a Catholic university and espoused Catholic beliefs. That, of course, was awful. And we are still dealing with the backlash of such insane suggestions made by this NFL kicker. What we didn't really talk about was at around the same time, Anthony Fauci, the former head of the NIAID, National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, he was the czar of science, the science czar, healthcare czar during the COVID pandemic. There were action figures made of him. There were, he basically kind of transcended into a certain level of priesthood almost among certain people in this country, where he hung on every word he said. Anthony Fauci was the science. The scientific method is listen to Anthony Fauci. I feel like I remember a different definition in school, but I'm gathering it's just listen to Anthony Fauci, or at least that's what it was a couple years ago. So he delivers a commencement speech at Columbia University and discusses several things, mainly how much we need to beware of anti-science. And who better to hear it from than the Fauci himself?
Science is integral to who you and I are. Unfortunately, during the COVID pandemic, significant anti-science forces tragically sometimes aligned with political ideology accelerated in our society and became louder and more entrenched over time. This phenomenon, which feeds on the denigration of scientific evidence and data, is deeply disturbing because the pathway from disparaging evidence and facts to undermining the foundation of our social order is a very slippery slope. And history has taught us that lesson multiple times. During the past 4 years, we have witnessed an alarming increase in the mischaracterization, distortion, and even vilification of solid evidence-based scientific findings.
You don't say.
And of scientists themselves. At the same time, conspiracy theories arose that became intermixed with these anti-science sentiments. The net result, understandably, was that public confusion was sowed and trust in evidence-based public health principles was eroded. This became crystal clear as we fought to overcome false rumors about the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines during the vaccine rollout. I can confirm to you today that Bill Gates and I did not put chips in the COVID vaccines. And no, and no, COVID vaccines and I did not, and vaccines are not responsible for more deaths than COVID itself.
Okay, so Anthony Fauci can confirm that he did not put microchips in the mRNA vaccine. Awesome, dude. Can you confirm that the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus that leaked in Wuhan didn't leak from the coronavirus laboratory in Wuhan? Can you confirm that? Because that's what we were told. Not too many people tried to tell us that they were putting microchips in the vaccines. Some people did, not too many. A far larger amount of people tried to tell us that this originated from pangolin stew or something. Is that scientific? Is it scientific to examine the probabilities of case A, the lab leak, and case B, the miraculous appearance of coronavirus across the street from the lab that had nothing to do with each other? Is that not anti-science to lean in the favor of that coincidence over this obvious reality? What would Occam's razor suggest? You know, the idea that when you're facing a conundrum, go with the most likely, most easily explained occurrence? No, it seems like in this situation, we're going to go with the least likely, least feasible explanation. And the other one's racist. Occam's racist. I don't think Anthony can confirm much of that. Let's pop back in on this, see what else he says.
We should not confuse diversity of opinion or political ideology with the divisiveness that we are currently experiencing in our country. What troubles me greatly is that differences of opinion or ideology have in certain circumstances been reflected by egregious distortions of reality.
You don't say.
Sadly, elements of our society are driven by a cacophony of falsehoods, lies, and conspiracy theories that get repeated often enough that after a while, they stand largely unchallenged, ominously leading to an insidious acceptance of what I call the normalization of untruths. We see this happen on a daily basis, propagated through a range of information platforms, social medias, and enterprises who pass themselves off as news organizations.
Now, here's the crazy thing about what we just listened to, is that any sensible, normal, conscious person hears that and goes, yeah, we do exist and did exist during that time in a culture of the normalization of untruths, where all these things were repeated and repeated over and over again, that we just began to accept them unquestioningly as the truth. And if you're a person like me, you're thinking, yeah, that is so accurate. We just accepted that wearing a dirty mask everywhere you went and putting it on every time you stood up from your table at a bar to go to the bathroom, but you could take it off when you sat down. We just accepted that that was actually effective in preventing the spread, or that it wasn't causing more adverse effects when we made children wear them in school and had people breathing in their own germs over and over again. And, we just accepted that that was still better than, God forbid, walking outside with a mask off. We just accepted. No, you got it. We just accepted that ivermectin, a drug that has been used millions and millions of times for several years, I don't know exactly how long, but a long time, we just accepted that it was not viable as a treatment for COVID, even though it had been shown to help with COVID. The only viable solution was the vaccine developed by our pharmaceutical companies. In fact, natural immunity itself, the thing that every biological organism has used to fend off infections since the dawn of time, your immune system, how you would get unsick before we invented vaccines a century ago. You may recall there was like thousands and millions of years of biological history prior to the invention of the vaccine, and people tended to, fight off diseases. How did they do that? Natural immunity. Vaccines, the things that is there, I don't know if you know this, but they're there to simulate natural immunity. The old conventional technology for a vaccine is to expose your body to a dead or inert form of the virus so it develops the antibodies to fight off the actual virus should you come into contact with it. So it stimulates natural immunity. Well, the mRNA technology actually takes it one step further, where they actually, artificially inject you with the proper protein or whatever, or the mRNA needed to fight off COVID. And so it actually simulates natural immunity. Not even stimulates, really, simulates it. Artificial simulation of natural immunity is actually better than natural immunity. We just accepted that. And if you said natural immunity as a viable case, like, hey man, I got COVID already, I have the antibodies, why do I need to still get vaccinated to stimulate or simulate immunity when I already have immunity? And especially, why are you so adamant about it that I'm not even allowed to potentially work at my job or go to school or all the other things that people were pitching as a result of not getting vaccinated? We just accepted it to be true. So you're sitting there thinking yeah, he's right. So many things we just accepted as true because it was repeated often enough. But the crazy thing is, he's talking about you. He's not talking about all the things we just discussed, all the normalized untruths that we were exposed to over the past 2 years. No, he's talking about you. You're the one who's anti-science. You're the conspiracy theorist. Natural immunity is a conspiracy theory. Alternative methods of fighting an infectious disease outside of Pfizer and Moderna's experimental mRNA technology is a conspiracy theory. Wearing 1 to 2 dirty masks over the course of a month and wearing it everywhere you go and putting it on when you stand up from a table but not when you sit down, not thinking that that does anything useful or that it may not lead to other adverse effects, that's a conspiracy theory, guys. Not thinking that the virus miraculously and coincidentally emerged across the street from the Wuhan coronavirus lab in a bowl of bat soup, that is a conspiracy theory. The fact that if you said that on Facebook, as we've discussed in the past, in 2020, and those articles or posts would be removed as mis or disinformation, while instead the idea of this highly unlikely and unfeasible non-lab leak theory was pushed down your throat and repeated and repeated and repeated, no matter how much sense it didn't make. And then we just stopped talking about it once the lie became too apparent. That was the science. And you not believing in that constantly repeated truth or untruth, that you are the conspiracy theorist. And you need to beware of you for thinking, for critically thinking, and not just thinking, but questioning what these people in robes and stupid fucking hats sitting up there so self-satisfied with who they are and their, what do you call it? Their accolades. I went to Columbia. I'm Ivy League. Why don't you just trust us, the experts? Who are you? The idea that you would ever question anything that they say, regardless of the fact that in the meantime, you've lost your job, you've lost your social life, you're divided amongst your family and friends, you're the bad guy. It honestly, I don't know if you can tell, it gets me going, man, when I think about it. And I'm not going to stop thinking about it because that's what they want you to do. They want you to stop thinking about it. They want you to move past it. They want you to forget about it. I had a conversation a while ago with somebody when we were discussing this lab leak theory thing, and they were like, well, at this point, it's like, why is it so important to you to find out where it came from? Like, the important thing is that we solve it, we address it, and we move society forward. It's like, no, I actually think it matters perhaps the most. Perhaps the most. Why should we not get to the bottom of how this pandemic, this global pandemic that killed millions of people and shut down the world for years on end and changed the course of history forever? Why should we not be interested in finding out how that happened? I don't know, perhaps to stop it from happening again, to hold the people who made it happen in the first place accountable? I don't think that's a crazy thing. You find somebody that was clearly murdered, perhaps you conduct an investigation to find the person who murdered them. No. Look, the person's already dead. It's probably more important that we console the family, we make the funeral arrangements, and we just move past this. Why are you so focused on finding the murderer? I don't know. Maybe so he doesn't murder another person? Maybe so that person can be held accountable and dealt with, and we can prevent it in the future? But it's amazing. There is such a religious adherence to this quote-unquote science that in every way, it is the most anti-science mentality I can imagine. Being unquestioning to a set of ideas, being incurious to why something exists or occurred or whatever, and instead encouraging people to be ignorant to it, to move past it, that it doesn't need an explanation, that nothing we tell you needs an explanation. That's a scientifically minded person? No, that's a religiously minded person. Hey, don't question, look, don't blaspheme, don't question the science, okay? This is a science. What do you think you know more than them? Shut up, do what they tell you. No, we don't care how it happened. It just happened. It just happened. That sounds a lot more religious than scientific to me. But according to Anthony Fauci, that's just because I'm just way off base. I've just been exposed to too many normalized untruths. So let's actually review this new development, these leaks. This is actually a good article. This is from, Jesus Christ with the ads. So this article is from the New York Post, and it talks about the speech and the context of the speech pretty much the same way we discussed it, that this was happening at the same time while we were all caught up in Harrison Butker's religious take at a religious university. And it says, Fauci, this is about Fauci, he lied under oath to Congress and said that the NIH, the National Institute of Health, did not fund Frankenstein gain-of-function research. He lied to his underlings at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He is the head of the NIAID. Covered up their funding of EcoHealth Alliance, which we'll talk about, which subcontracted the dangerous research to sloppy scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where it most likely escaped and killed millions of people. Most likely is an understatement. The very day that Fauci was at Columbia last week, EcoHealth finally saw its federal funding suspended for failing to adequately oversee the Chinese research. No kidding. That's pretty awesome. Why would EcoHealth have their funding suspended? EcoHealth is the nonprofit headed by Peter Daszak, whose emails we're going to look into in a moment, that was funding, allegedly, this gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The day after Fauci's speech, his ex-colleague, former NIH acting director Lawrence Tabak, contradicted him when he testified before the House Oversight Committee. Tabak said Fauci's outfit, the NIAID, did indeed fund gain-of-function research in Wuhan through EcoHealth Alliance. Okay, so gain-of-function research, just to kind of, bring everybody back up to pace with all these things that we've heard, we used to hear all the time during the COVID era. Gain-of-function research is the type of research done where scientists are basically genetically modifying viruses, giving them new functions, gain of function. I'm not an epidemiologist myself. I'm not an expert on this, but the basic layman's version of this is that scientists are genetically modifying viruses that already exist in the world. In this circumstance, they are taking sarbecoviruses or whatever that exist in bats, types of coronaviruses that exist are found in like bat populations and different populations, primarily in China, that they believe have the highest potential to infect humans at some point in the future. So then the scientists actually genetically modify these viruses in a lab to artificially make them be able to infect human cells in order to study what happens when they infect a human. So in a preemptive attempt to stop these viruses from jumping species into humans and infecting us, and them being caught off guard as to how to defend against it, they make the virus able to affect humans in a laboratory artificially to study what would happen if that happened. And then some might say at that point that virus is leaked, and now this virus that otherwise would not have been able to infect us is now infecting us. Now, I'm not saying that was done on purpose. I'm not saying it's not done on purpose. I'm not convinced, and I don't really know why I should be convinced or have that much reason to trust bioengineering research being done in China that coincidentally leads to a world-shattering pandemic. I'm not gonna pontificate on that either way. I'm gonna leave that one open. But regardless, this is an example of science. I'm going to assume maybe I'm going to assume they're doing something that they believe to be good. And maybe it is ultimately good. Maybe it is ultimately good that we perform this type of research so that we're not caught off guard should this ever happen. It just is a major shame that it also happens to be the reason that it happened. It's silly to consider the profiteering aspect of this type of research. Yes, this research may be necessary. Sure. War is necessary. But we also acknowledge all the time that a lot of war isn't necessary, but the military-industrial complex has an immense vested interest in more global conflicts, more use of their weapons and manufacturing. And so perhaps they may have an interest in funneling more money into their industries. Sort of like how you may have an interest in funneling more money into your industry. You may have an interest in getting paid more at your job. Or if you're a self-employed contractor, perhaps you may have an interest in getting more work. Well, I venture to guess that that same principle goes for the military-industrial complex. It goes for the science research industry, getting more money funneled into their research. It goes for the pharmaceutical companies, such as Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and what have you, that may have a vested interest in making sure that their product is considered to be the only product that is a viable solution to whatever thing is going on right now. They may have a profitable, incentive there. I don't know. I'd hate to be anti-science. Yet the vested interests in ignoring and dismissing the possibility of a COVID lab leak are legion. They include the Chinese authorities, the World Health Organization, that's the WHO, and the American scientific establishment, especially Dr. Anthony Fauci. They include EcoHealth Alliance, a New York nonprofit headed up by Peter Daszak. EcoHealth Alliance has trousered millions of U.S. taxpayer dollars since the SARS outbreak. And there are many other also invested in denying or dismissing the idea of a lab leak. There are some virologists who don't want a light shown on their risky gain-of-function gravy train. And there is the academic world in general, which is terrified of doing anything to slow the flow of funds from China. Indeed, we know that the head of Harvard Medical School, George Daly, called Dr. Fauci on February 2nd, 2020. That's like when COVID started, or when we first really started kind of being aware of it, to ask him to intervene to reassure a Chinese company, Evergrande, which was offering Harvard a donation of $115 million. What could this Chinese property firm possibly need to hear from America's top pandemic scientist? As investigative journalist Ashley Rinsberg reports, Daly wrote to Fauci saying, quote, "I met yesterday with a team led by Jack Chia, CEO of China's Evergrande company, and Dr. Jack Liu, Evergrande's chief health officer. They wanted, quote, whatever information you are willing to share on your current efforts to coordinate a response to COVID." Evergrande went bust this year before delivering the cash, but the incentive it was offering to shut up about the possibility of a lab leak was probably obvious to all. And sure enough, 2 days after the call with Evergrande, Dr. Fauci and his colleagues started shutting down speculation of a lab leak, even though they had open-mindedly discussed the possibility over the preceding weekend, with some scientists deeming it, quote, friggin' likely. Harvard Medical School declined to reply to Rindsberg's requests for a comment. As we jump into this next article, kind of skip ahead, this is an article called The Shameless Cover-Up of the Lab Leak Theory. And I'm going to go down to the bottom here where it talks about how the funding was allocated. It says, this week, Emily Kopp from an organization called US Right to Know received another leak. This was an earlier version of Dassic's proposal. Dassic is the head of EcoHealth, the nonprofit that was performing this research and diverting funds to certain laboratories or whatever, including Wuhan, allegedly. This was an earlier version of Dassic's proposal on which Dassic and Barrick had typed marginal comments. Incredibly, these show that Dassic intended to receive DARPA, that's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, kind of clunky, and do more of the work in Wuhan. If we win this contract, this is a quote, I do not propose that all of this work will necessarily be conducted by Ralph Barrick, but I do want to stress the U.S. side of this proposal so that DARPA is comfortable with our team. Once we get the funds, we can then allocate who does what exact work, and I believe that a lot of these assays can be done in Wuhan as well. So this is why, while they're applying for this grant from the NIH, and Peter Daszak, who wants this grant that Fauci denied ever happened, Peter Daszak wants to stress or kind of conveniently ignore the fact that not all this research is going to be done in the U.S. So let's stress the U.S. side of this. Let's not really talk too much about the fact that probably some of this is going to be being performed in China. And why wouldn't he want them to know that? It says, Barrick then replied that this meant the work would be done at lower biosafety levels, BSL-2 instead of BSL-3, not to be confused with DSL-2, which is great. In the U.S., these recombinant SARS-CoV viruses studied under BSL-3. In China, we might be growing these viruses under BSL-2. U.S. researchers will likely freak out. Okay, so BSL-2 and 3 are basically levels of security within the laboratory. And the U.S. laboratories, where the NIH seemed to be under the impression, or Peter Daszak wanted the NIH to be under the impression that that's where this type of research would be being performed. He wanted to give the impression that it was going to be performed in U.S. laboratories because these specific U.S. laboratories operate under a higher level of security and protocol when dealing with these viruses. However, the laboratories in China, the Wuhan Institute specifically, Barrick says they operate under BSL-2, which is a lower level of security. So if we include that that's going to be part of where the funding and research takes place, they're not going to be into that because we're dealing with some heavy shit here, dude. And we're not going to get the funding if we make them abundantly aware that we're going to be performing this research in China under much lower levels of security and safety precautions. So that's an email between them that we just came across. So not only do we have the acknowledgement that there will be research being taken place in China, but we also have the guy who is applying for the grant acknowledging that he doesn't really want to talk about that too much in this application process because both of them are aware that we are exposing ourselves to a higher level of risk by conducting this research in China. So going back to this New York Post thing, it says committee chairman James Comer, Republican from Kentucky, that is the House subcommittee on the COVID investigations that is still ongoing, also revealed emails from Fauci's former long-term senior advisor, David Morenz, to his good friend Peter Daszak, the head of EcoHealth, boasting about evading Freedom of Information Act requests. Quote, I learned from our FOIA lady, that's Freedom of Information Act lady, here how to make emails disappear after I am FIOA'd, but before the search starts. So I think we are safe. That's a direct email from the senior advisor to Fauci at the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases to Peter Daszak, the head of EcoHealth that's getting this grant for the gain of research funding. That's a direct email saying, hey, I learned how to basically get rid of any incriminating emails before this investigation starts. So, and I quote, I think we're all safe. Weird. This is from another New York Post article. 3 other emails listed the number of a National Institutes of Health grant, NIH, made to the Manhattan-based EcoHealth for a project titled, quote, Understanding the Risk of Bat Coronavirus Emergence, which initiated in 2014 and was renewed in 2019. This is the number of the grant. I'm just going to say it once. Not that it matters. 2R01A I110964 was the NIH grant that Fauci lied about in 3 U.S. Senate hearings in which he claimed knowingly, willfully, and brazenly untruthfully that the NIH had not funded virus gain-of-function research and enhanced potential pandemic pathogen research on SARS-related coronaviruses in Wuhan. Morenz's April 26, 2020 email included in the whistleblower disclosures came 2 days after the NIH suspended EcoHealth's grant after having, quote, improperly renewed the funding without a secretary-level risk-benefit review by the Department of Health and Human Services, which is mandated by federal policy. That proposal for a renewed grant set forth plans to construct more such novel chimeric viruses, that is genetically modified viruses, targeting viruses having even higher affinities for human receptors and higher pandemic potential. So this is a quote from an EcoHealth Alliance spokesperson. Quote, the grant in question was suspended by NIH after an arbitrary decision by then President Trump to cancel the grant. Dr. Daszak was naturally concerned about this unexpected and unjustified political interference in EcoHealth Alliance's approved NIH funding. The NIH terminated the grant in August 2022, informing EcoHealth Alliance in a letter that it had not complied with the terms and conditions attached to the funding while allowing for a potential renegotiation of the award in the future. NIH did not reinstate the grant in May 2023, that's just last year, with EcoHealth Alliance proposing a renegotiated work plan that removed any on-the-ground activities in China. The Department of Health and Human Services banned the Wuhan Institute of Virology from receiving U.S. government funding for the next 10 years. Why would they do that? So, okay, before we finish the rest of this article, just last year in 2023, the Department of Health and Human Services banned the Wuhan Institute of Virology from receiving U.S. government funding for the next 10 years. Now, mind you that simultaneously we were being told to believe that this wasn't a leak from the Wuhan coronavirus lab, dude. But we are going to ban this lab from receiving funding for the next 10 years. We're just going to do that, but not because they did anything. We're just going to do it. The House COVID subcommittee last year unearthed other emails from Morenz in which he claimed to, quote, always communicate on Gmail because my NIH email is FOIA'd constantly, Freedom of Information Acted constantly, and to, quote, delete anything I don't want to see in the New York Times. And finally, quote, Morenz says in a July 2021 email, Tony does not want his fingerprints on origin stories, Tony being Anthony Fauci. So that's a whole bunch of information to throw at you. The summary being that we have several emails between Peter Daszak, the head of the EcoHealth Alliance, the nonprofit that was conducting this research in U.S. laboratories and also in China laboratories such as the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where this virus may have somehow emerged, that the National Institute of Health did in fact grant him the funding to conduct such research, and that there was several lines of communication and much action taken to cover up the idea that this had anything to do with COVID-19 and the leak of SARS-CoV-2 onto the world. This is quotes from their own emails. And this is just the emails that we got, because they also speak about deleting them before a search starts, avoiding the Freedom of Information Act. And you got to wonder, I should say, why? I don't recall deleting any of my emails in 2020 when they began the investigation into the origin of COVID. But these gentlemen, for some reason, I can't put my finger on why, they really did feel the need to do so. Now, again, Anthony Fauci wants to assure you, and the betters among us at Columbia University and the academics and the elites and the scientists and the experts, that it was you who were purveying the conspiracy theories. It was you who were believing in the lies and normalizing these untruths. It was you who was anti-science. And it was you that was stopping us from reaching a resolution for this pandemic. It was you. In the background, of course, Anthony Fauci and those in his circle, as we were coming to find more and more each day, were doing everything in their power to eliminate any evidence or any leads to the fact that this research was being done and funded, and it was being done improperly at lower levels of security, and that since then, these grants have been rescinded because of that fact, that Wuhan Institute of Virology is not eligible to receive U.S. funding for research for the next 10 years. All of these things are coincidences, folks. And the most obvious coincidence of all is that they are covering it up. Because that in no way implies that there's anything that needs to be covered up. So take that for what you will. People say COVID politics is over. COVID politics is over. The lessons we learned from COVID and continue to learn are not over. And so while these people continue to have their jobs, continue to have the door left open for more funding, more grants, Anthony Fauci is invited to the most prestigious schools in the world to speak on how stupid you are and how smart they are. So it's easy enough to examine all the different things at play here. There is obviously an incentive in the research industry and the people that are conducting that research to keep the, quote, gravy train rolling. Everybody wants more business. Everybody wants to make more money. And when your money is conducting this type of research, in the case of this industry, or when your money is developing weapons and ammunition and things like that, in the case of the military-industrial complex, or when your business is developing pharmaceutical products to deal with such pandemics as this, or anything else that may exist, then all of these people have a vested interest in making sure that money continues to come in for this research. If you're someone who conducts gain-of-function research, you need to constantly be justifying why you need these millions of dollars to continue doing what you're doing. And perhaps you may even be incentivized to exaggerate or leave out or omit some pertinent details or points of note that may affect your ability to keep money coming in. Or perhaps in the case of Harvard Medical School, a Chinese company is offering you a $115 million donation and wants to speak with Anthony Fauci. And coincidentally, Anthony Fauci begins a campaign of shutting down any insight into a potential lab leak theory shortly thereafter. But don't follow the money, folks. Don't follow human incentives. Don't read the writing on the wall. You are the problem. Till next time, folks, my name is Jimmy Selesky, live from the studio. Hit the subscribe button for new content every Monday through Friday. Leave us a like, leave us a dislike, leave us a comment. Peace.